Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're bringing you part 3 in our Mage Knight tutorial series. We're going to be covering combat with enemies and then wounds and healing. Alright, now the player versus player combat will be a separate video, and then that one will be relatively short compared to this one, as player versus player uses a lot of the concepts and mechanisms that you'll find in this video. And then I believe there will actually be a 5th video. This series has kind of started spreading out. A 5th video that will also be pretty short, covering some of the specifics regarding setting up individual scenarios and that sort of thing. So today we're doing combat versus enemies and wounds and healing. Be sure to check out part 1 and 2 if you haven't seen those. Now before we get down to the table, I want to mention our sponsor, Noble Knight Games. You can go over to nobleknight.com and you will find everything you need for your board game collection. They have a ton of new board games, old board games, everything in between. They're constantly getting the new hotness in. They're constantly keeping stock of all the good stuff from the past. But not only do they have board games, they have all kinds of supplies for your gaming needs. Lots of dice. If you need dice, they've got them. If you need other stuff, they've got them. If you want RPGs, war games, minis, historical minis, Magic the Gathering, all kinds of other CCGs, all that stuff is over at nobleknight.com. So be sure to check them out. They really a fantastic website, fantastic supply of just everything you need for your gaming habit. All right, with anything else, let's get into Mage Knight. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know for combat as well as wounds and healing. Combat is probably the most complex part of this game, and so once you understand this, then you really have most of what you need in terms of grokking the game to really get into it and really start enjoying everything Mage Knight has to offer. Here we go. There are several ways to initiate combat with an enemy. Entering a space with an unconquered fortified site, such as a keep, a mage tower, or a city, is considered an assault, and the player must fight the defenders of that site. These sites are always considered fortified. Also, anytime the player makes an assault against one of these sites, they lose 1 reputation regardless of the outcome of combat. If another player owns the keep, then it is still considered an assault, and the current player still loses 1 reputation. If the other player is present, then player versus player combat begins. If not, then the player must fight a random gray enemy. This enemy will be worth half its normal fame. If the player is at an adventure site, such as a dungeon, tomb, monster den, spawning grounds, or ruins, the player announces they are entering the site as their action. This initiates combat with all enemies present. If the player is standing at a monastery, they may announce they are going to attempt to burn it down. When doing this, they immediately receive -3 reputation and then draw a random purple enemy as the defender of the monastery. If the player is adjacent to 1 or more rampaging enemies, orcs or draconum, they can challenge them to combat. The player may challenge 1 or multiple. Alternatively, the player can provoke an adjacent rampaging enemy by moving from their current adjacent position to another adjacent position. Only 1 combat is allowed each turn. However, there are some situations in which enemies from multiple spaces can be fought simultaneously. It's possible, for instance, a single move may provoke 2 rampaging enemies. The player will be required to fight them both. An assault is a move, and therefore it's possible the player will provoke 1 or more rampaging enemies when making an assault. In this case, the player will have to fight the defenders of the assault and the rampaging enemies simultaneously. Keep in mind, though, that the rampaging enemies are not fortified by the site, and the player may conquer the assaulted site even if they do not defeat the rampaging enemy. If the player's move started a combat and there are 1 or more rampaging enemies adjacent to the space, they may then challenge those rampaging enemies to join the fight. The player may not challenge extra enemies when entering an adventure site. Also, the player may never fight in PvP combat and also fight enemy tokens at the same time. To start combat, the player reveals all involved enemies they must fight. Combat then consists of 4 phases. ranged and siege attack phase, block phase, assigned damage phase, and finally the attack phase. The player may play additional combat effects during these phases, and these may affect the player's units, enemies, or combat rules and generally persist until the end of the turn. However, it's really important to remember any non-attack or non-block effect from a red card or unit ability that costs red mana to activate has no effect on enemies with fire resistance, and likewise, non-attack and non-block effects from blue cards or unit ability that costs blue mana to activate has no effect on enemies with ice resistance. So for instance, Chill, which is a blue mana spell, normally prevents enemies from attacking this turn. However, if an enemy has ice resistance, this spell will have no effect on them. Players may play any number of special effects during these phases. However, healing effects may not be played. During the ranged and siege attack phase, the player may perform one or more attacks or pass and do nothing. To perform an attack, the player chooses one or more enemy tokens as the target of the attack. The player then plays any number of ranged and or siege attacks. The player may play cards that provide ranged or siege attacks from their hand, as you see here. They may use ranged and or siege attack skills and or activate any units with ranged or siege attack abilities. Players should stack all these effects together in a column to help keep track of their total. If some of the chosen enemies are fortified, as you see here, then only siege attacks can be played. Ranged attacks may only be played in this phase if none of the enemies are fortified. But if no chosen enemy is fortified, the player may use both ranged and siege attacks. Enemies that are fortified twice because they have the fortified ability and they're defending a fortified site cannot be attacked during this phase at all. Also, cards may not be played sideways to contribute to ranged or siege attacks. The player now totals the attack value of all played effects. If at least one targeted enemy has one or more resistance icons, then all attacks of that type are inefficient, which means their strength is halved down. But this enemy has physical resistance, which means the 5 ranged physical attack would be halved and rounded down to 2. Cold fire attacks are only halved when there is at least one targeted enemy with both ice and fire resistance. To be successful, the attack value must be equal to or greater than the total armor values of all targeted enemies. Defeated enemy tokens are immediately discarded to the discard pile. The attacking player also immediately scores the indicated fame for each defeated enemy. Remember though that if they cross to a new line, the player does not level up immediately. This occurs at the end of the turn. If the attack value is lower than the total armor of the targeted enemies, it will have no effect. Damage is never carried over to subsequent phases or turns, so for this reason, if the player realizes their attacks are not enough, they need to either choose a different enemy, play more attacks, or take back the cards and cancel the attack. The player can declare none, one, or more attacks during this phase. With each attack, the player can defeat one or multiple enemies. Remember to group the cards for each attack separately. So for instance, this attack right here can be thrown against this enemy, while this attack against this enemy. In this way, the player can separate fortified enemies from non-fortified enemies, so they can use siege attack against the fortified enemies and ranged attack against the non-fortified. In this same way, it may also be worthwhile to split up enemies that have different resistances. Next begins the block phase. In this phase, all enemies that have not been eliminated get to attack, and players will have the opportunity to block these attacks. A blocked enemy deals no damage in the next phase, the assigned damage phase. The players may block any number of attacking enemies during this phase, but each enemy is resolved individually. Players may not block multiple enemies at once. For each enemy with a summon icon, draw a brown enemy token and add it to the enemy group. For both the block phase and the assigned damage phase, the summoned monster replaces the summoning enemy. As long as the summoned monster remains present, no effect can target the enemy that summoned it. However, the summoned monster may be targeted normally. After resolving any necessary summonings, the player chooses a single attacking enemy to block. The player then plays any number of blocks of any elemental type. As usual, the player may play cards that provide block from their hand, use block skills, or activate any units with block abilities. Also, any card may be turned sideways to count as one block. These will always be considered physical block and never one of the other elemental types. When determining the total amount of block value, keep the following in mind. Against elemental attacks, only certain blocks are fully efficient. Any type of block is efficient against physical attack. Only ice or cold fire blocks are efficient against fire attacks. Only fire or cold fire blocks are efficient against ice attacks. And only cold fire blocks are efficient against cold fire attacks. Any block that is inefficient is reduced by half, rounded down. The block is considered successful if the total value equals or exceeds the attack value of the chosen enemy. In this case, even though it's inefficient, there is still 4 block total, which will block this 2 ice attack. However, if the enemy has the Swift ability, as you see here, its attack value is doubled for the purposes of blocking. So in this case, even though there's 4 block against 3 attack, Swift makes this effectively 6 attack, and so this block will not be enough. A successfully blocked enemy is set aside for the moment. Its attack was stopped, and it will do no damage during the assigned damage phase coming up. However, it is not eliminated yet. The player will have the chance to eliminate it during the melee attack phase after the assigned damage phase. If a summon monster is successfully blocked, discard it to the corresponding discard pile, but do not gain the indicated fame. If the player's block total is lower than the attack value of the enemy they are attempting to block, it has no effect. The player cannot lower the attack value by playing blocks. The player either blocks it fully or not at all. Sometimes block cards will have effects other than adding to the player's block total. Unless stated otherwise, these apply whether or not the block was successful. If all enemies are either dead or blocked at this point, players can skip the assigned damage phase. However, any enemies that are still alive and unblocked at the beginning of the assigned damage phase will now deal damage from their attacks. All unblocked enemies are processed one by one in whatever order the player chooses. Each enemy deals damage equal to its attack value. If the enemy has Brutal, as you see here, it deals twice as much damage as its attack value. The player must assign all damage. The player can assign damage to one or more of their units, but then the rest must be assigned to their hero. The player can assign damage to a unit as long as it is not wounded. Even if the unit is spent, it may still have damage assigned to it as long as it's unwounded. Whenever a unit is assigned damage, put a wound card on the unit. After placing the wound card on the unit, then reduce the damage total by the unit's armor value. Assigning even a single point of damage to a unit will wound it, regardless of its armor value. The armor value simply determines how much damage the unit can absorb in total. However, if the unit is resistant to the elements of the attack, then it is handled a little bit differently. As you can see, this enemy is dealing 3 physical damage, and the Guardian Golems are resistant to physical damage. So first, reduce the amount of damage by the unit's armor amount without wounding the unit. So this would be reduced by 3, so that leaves it with 0. If this absorbs all the damage, as you see here, nothing further happens. If there is any remaining damage, in this case there would be 1 remaining damage, continue assigning damage as usual to this unit by wounding it, and then reducing the damage again by the armor value. If a unit is assigned damage but does not get wounded because of a resistance, it still cannot be assigned damage again during the same combat. If a player cannot or does not want to assign damage to a unit, or if there is still damage left over after assigning damage to their units, they must assign all remaining damage to their hero. This is done repeatedly until all damage is assigned. So let's say the full 3 damage this enemy is dealing is all going to go to the player, and the player currently has 2 armor. First, the player puts a wound card into their hand. They then reduce the damage total by their hero's armor value, in this case 2. The player then repeats this process until all damage has been assigned. So in the case of this enemy, the player would receive a total of 2 wounds in their hand. Remember that even if the player receives just 1 damage And regardless of what their armor value is, they will receive a wound for that 1 damage. If the number of wounds added to the player's hand during a combat equals or exceeds their unmodified hand limit, in this case 5, they are knocked out and must immediately discard all non-wound cards from their hand. This includes wounds received from other sources during combat, such as effects of some cards. While knocked out, the player's units may continue to fight, and the player can use any of their skills. The player also will continue taking wounds if they need to assign further damage. If an enemy has the poison ability and it deals a wound to a unit, it actually deals 2 wounds. This means the unit will need to be healed twice to be fully healed. If a hero is assigned damage from a unit with poison, they must put 1 wound into their discard pile for each wound placed in their hand. If an enemy has the paralyze ability, as you see here, and it would deal a wound to a unit, that unit is immediately destroyed. If a hero takes a wound from a unit with paralyze, they must immediately discard all non-wound cards from their hand. If an enemy has the summon ability, the player assigns the damage of the summoned enemy, and then after the attack, the summoned enemy is discarded to the appropriate discard pile. Once all damage from unblocked enemies is assigned, players move to the attack phase. The attack phase works exactly the same way as the ranged and siege attack phase, except the players now can combine any form of attack. Regular, ranged, and siege may all be used, and there is no difference between them during this phase. As usual, any non-wound card may be played sideways as attack 1. This will be physical attack. The player also may now use any effects that are labeled as usable in the attack phase only. As in the ranged and siege attack phase, the player may eliminate multiple enemies in one attack or declare multiple individual attacks. Finally, be sure to remember all the rules for resistances, as they are the same as they were during the ranged and siege attack phase. Combat ends after the attack phase. The player may defeat none, 1, or more of their enemies. If the player was assaulting a city, they put 1 of their shield tokens on the city card for each enemy they defeated. It's important that shields placed on a city are placed in a row, so the order that players defeated enemies can be remembered. If the player defeated all the enemies, depending on the site they're at, different things may happen. If the player defeated 1 or more rampaging enemies, they remove their token from the board. And for the rest of the game, this rampaging enemy icon has no effect. If the enemy was a orc marauder, the player gains 1 reputation. If it was a draconum, they gain 2 reputation. If the player defeated all enemies on an adventure site, they mark the space with a shield token. At the end of their turn, they can claim the reward indicated on the site description card. The player should wait until after their turn to pick the reward so other players can begin playing. If the player defeated all defenders of a fortified site, they end their turn on the conquered space. If the site is a keep or a mage tower, as you see here, mark it with a shield. If it was a mage tower, the player will also receive a spell as their reward. And if it was a city, the player gains rewards based on the city. If the player defeated the defenders of a monastery, mark the monastery with a shield. The monastery is now burned and is treated like an empty space for the remainder of the game. At the end of the player's turn, they'll gain an artifact. If the player did not defeat all the enemies at their site, then if it is a rampaging enemy, it stays in its space. If the player failed to defeat enemies drawn for a dungeon, tomb, or monastery, discard them. The next time a hero attempts to fight here, a new enemy will be drawn. If the player failed to defeat the enemy in a monster den, or 1 or both monsters for the spawning grounds or the ruins, the remaining monsters stay face up on the space. The next time a hero attempts to fight here, they will fight the same enemies. Anytime a player fails to defeat all the defenders of a fortified site, they have to withdraw back to the space they were attacking from. City assaults work the same way as assaulting any other fortified site, but in addition to the fortification, each city gives a bonus to their defending units. The white city gives their defending units +1 armor, as you can see here. The blue city gives all defenders +2 attack if they have ice or fire attack, and +1 attack if they have cold fire attack. In the Red City, all defenders that have physical attack gain the Brutal ability, and in the Green City, all defenders that have physical attack gain the Poison ability. If a city is conquered, its new leader must be determined. The player with the most shield tokens on the city card becomes the leader. In this case, Norowas would be the leader. If there is a tie for leader, the player who placed a shield first is the winner. In this case, Norowas would still be the leader. The leader takes the city card, including all the shield tokens on it, and places it in front of their play area. If the players agree, or if they are playing a fully cooperative scenario, they can cooperate to conquer a city. A player can initiate a cooperative city assault on their turn if the end of round has not yet been announced and the scenario conditions have not yet been fulfilled. They have not taken an action yet since the assault will be their action. Their figure is on a space adjacent to the city and there is no other player on that space. And there are one or more suitable heroes present. A hero is considered suitable if they are on a space adjacent to their city and if they have not had their round order token flipped face down yet. The active player first announces they would like to form a cooperative assault. They then invite one or more suitable heroes, and they may decide to exclude suitable heroes if they wish. The player then proposes how to distribute the quantity of enemies in the city. To be clear, the players are simply splitting the number of enemies. They are not discussing the enemy types. Each player must be assigned at least one enemy. If all players agree, the assault begins. If an agreement cannot be met, then nothing happens. The active player may continue to try to find a proposal that can be agreed upon or continue their turn as normal. If the players agree to the proposal, all invited players flip their round order token face down. This indicates they give up their next turn. Then the player shuffles the enemies and randomly distributes them amongst the players respecting the agreed numbers. Again, this must be completely random. The players may not even look at the enemy type when handing them out. The participating players take turns assaulting the city according to the round order, starting with the player that initiated the cooperative attack. Each player performs all phases of their combat before the next player. Each player may use one die from the source as usual, along with all effects they could use before or during their turns. Players do not return used dice to the source until the entire assault is complete. Each player starts their assault by moving directly to the city. No other movement actions are allowed. If this happens to provoke one or more rampaging enemies, they will be added to that player's portion of enemies. As usual, players may voluntarily challenge any other rampaging enemies adjacent to the assaulted city and add them to their enemies. Players resolve the assault as usual, including reputation loss and assigning shields to the city card for defeated enemies. It's important to remember, each player faces only the enemies assigned to them and ignores all other enemies. This means that effects that affect all enemies affect only those assigned to that player. As usual, the city is conquered when all defenders are defeated. Rampaging enemies, as usual, are ignored for the purposes of determining if the city was defeated. If the city is not conquered, then all players withdraw to the space from which they attacked. Then the players take turns ending their turns as usual in round order. At this point, players can play any healing and special effects before the end of their turns, the same way as after a regular assault. As we've mentioned, when a hero gets wounded, the player takes one wound card per wound from the wound pile and puts it into their hand. Wound cards can never be discarded unless an effect explicitly states otherwise. Wound cards can also never be played sideways and cannot be discarded at the end of a player's turn. When the player chooses to rest for the turn, or when an effect allows them to discard a wound card, they go into the player's discard pile. When the round ends, any wounds in the player's hand get shuffled back into their deed deck along with the rest of their hand. As we've mentioned, wounded units have wound cards placed across the face of their card. Wounded units cannot be activated or assigned damage in combat. A wounded unit does retain its state of readiness, as we mentioned, and so a wounded unit that is spent still becomes ready at the start of a new round. But remember, it cannot be activated until healed. Players can heal during their turn even if their turn is a resting turn. The player can play effects that provide healing points, such as effects on cards, and they may also buy one or more healing points at a village or monastery. The player then adds up all healing points played or bought and then they can be used for the following healing effects. The player may use one or more healing points to throw away an equal number of wound cards from their hand. It's important to remember that throwing away a wound means it goes back to the wound stack. The player may heal a wounded unit by paying heal points equal to the level of the unit. In this case, 2 heal points would heal this unit. When a unit is healed, the wound card is thrown away. If the unit has 2 wound cards as a result of poison, then it will have to be healed twice to be fully healed. So in this case, 4 points of healing will be required to heal the Guardian Golems. To be clear, players can heal any time on their turn except during combat. But damage from a combat can be healed on the same turn once the combat is resolved. Also, any unspent healing points will disappear when entering combat. Finally, it's important to keep in mind that Magical Glade does not provide healing. Its effect may not be used on units and cannot be combined with other healing effects. So there you go. That's everything you need to know for combat versus enemies, as well as wounds and healing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you like my channel, please subscribe. Check out our Patreon. These videos are a ton of fun to make, but they do take quite a while, and any amount of help is greatly appreciated. There's a link in the cards as well as the description below for our Patreon. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.